Hello everyone. I just wanted to make a little video. I don't know how short it's going to be, but it's related to a video I posted earlier today, or I shared earlier today. Gavin Ortlund. I don't know much about him. I watched a few things. I watched his debate that he did, I think with Trent Horn, I think. Yeah, it was on salvation, or no, Sola Scriptura, whatever. I think he's a pastor not too far from here, an hour or so away. So I've been wanting to visit his service and see if there's any way I could get to meet him. But I don't know much about him. I guess he's a very prolific critic or apologist. I don't know what background he comes from. I do think, though, that James White has made a few videos critiquing him, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm guessing he's not of the Reformed tradition. So I don't know where he comes from, but maybe evangelical world. I'm not exactly sure. It doesn't really matter at this point as far as the subject here. So I shared a video. It was a question of whether the Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, has the fullness of the faith. So I posted it, and a friend of mine commented saying that he actually likes his stuff or whatever. And I just, I shared it. Whoever wants to watch it. I don't, I'm not necessarily promoting the content of the video, but I was answering the question of the video with my own, thought, overarching thought about Eastern Orthodoxy. And I have a lot of respect and admiration for Eastern Orthodoxy. I did make quite a lengthy video a couple of years ago, right after, or the day after, I went to Pascha at the local Orthodox church. I don't know what communion they're in, St. Andrew's over in Riverside, California. Father Josiah Trenham is pretty well known in the Eastern Orthodox community as a scholar, as a YouTuber type person. He has a lot of videos online. Anyway, and I had the privilege of talking to him actually about 10 years ago for about 2 hours. And it's just like any other priest, I would say. And a former Catholic friend of mine that he became Orthodox under his guidance, Father Trenham's guidance, told me that when I told him that, he said there's probably a lot of people in his congregation that would be very jealous that I was able to have 2 hours to chat with him uninterrupted or whatever. It was after one of his talks at the college I was teaching at, so I took my class over there to listen to him. Anyway, Eastern Orthodoxy. So anyway, I ended up watching the video. I wasn't planning on it, but it was only 28 minutes, so I watched it at 2 times the speed and listened to the whole thing, and I can't say that I disagree with anything really that he's saying other than his own perspective of what I guess salvation consists of, or what the doctrine of salvation is. Unfortunately, I have to disagree with that. I mean, it's a nice thought to have this kind of Protestant ecclesiology that that the church consists of true believers, no matter what denomination or church affiliation you might be. There are true believers in every denomination. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't believe that there is salvation, like a person can be saved outside of like formal communion with Roman Catholicism. That is certainly possible. The Catechism teaches that. But to say sort of positively that like Protestant churches or denominations or congregations are organs of the one true church, or part of, in some mysterious way, the Roman Catholic or the Catholic Church. I don't agree with that. Although I do think there are conservative-ish, maybe theologians that apparently are promoting that kind of concept, that and they'll use I guess recent church documents like Dominus Iesus, which is not really recent, it's about 20 years old by now, or 15, 20 years, something like that. I think 2002 roughly. So I guess that would be 22 years ago. Anyway, it's by Ratzinger, and of course Lumen Gentium. There's hints of that, I suppose, where there is, the church is seen as the universal sacrament of salvation. That if anyone is saved, it's because of the Catholic Church. if anyone is saved outside of full communion or true communion or formal communion with the Catholic Church, it's because of the Catholic Church. It's because the Catholic Church exists that any salvation is possible at all for anybody in this world. That's certainly a looser understanding than what you would find before Vatican II. And I think that's the dilemma here. And I think that's what Gavin Ortlund is trying to point out here, is that he doesn't, he's talking about like modern Orthodox folks talking about maybe, salvation outside or apart from formal communion with Eastern Orthodox ecclesial bodies. He claims, or Ortlund claims, that that the Eastern Orthodox apologists that do claim these things, they're not really presenting anything in the history of the tradition. And his claim is that it's actually foreign to the sort of 2,000 years, I guess, of Eastern Orthodox commentary and declarations and actions and things like that. So he doesn't find it in the history of Eastern Orthodox thought in the first 1,800 years of their history, if you include part of their history as being part of the Catholic Church. Of course, there's different perspectives as who split with who in the 11th century. So, and he also, the topic of the video was not about the Catholic Church, it was about the Orthodox Church. So he just kind of said in passing, that's also true of the claims of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is a true church from a Catholic perspective. And so any kind of sort of Vatican II, post-Vatican II, or even just before Vatican II, these ideas of that salvation could be sort of achieved or won or received outside of the visible unity with the Catholic Church is sort of a novel interpretation or a novel teaching. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, I certainly see that in the text, but of course, conservative-ish commentators would probably say, well, the church has the authority to interpret the church's documents. So, I mean, yeah, I guess functionally, yeah. So I just kind of submit, because who am I? I'm just a, sort of layperson, right? I'm not part of the hierarchy, the teaching. I'm not part of the ecclesia, docens, right? Or docens, I don't know how you pronounce that. Ecclesia. I'm not part of the church teaching. I'm part of the church learning. So I have to rely on the church documents and the books and the stuff like that, because I don't have church authority to say this is what the church teaches. I mean, I can present certain documents and I think, well, okay, this, you read this, passage from Pope so-and-so, or from, Vatican I, or from the Council of Trent or something like that. And it seems to mean this. I'm waiting for a correction by either the church or somebody who knows better about the history of the official teaching of the church. So anyway, so to the topic, I mean, I think from a Catholic perspective, so Gavin Ortlund points out, his main thing is that his position is that salvation is non-denominational, you could say, right? So you could have true believers, like I said earlier, true believers in all sorts of denominations or whatever. So what he's against is this sort of ecclesial exclusivity. I think that's the term he used. So some kind of exclusivity, or just some kind of unique claim of any kind of church. To say that we're the one true church. So the Eastern Orthodox, we're the one true church. The Oriental Orthodox, we're the one true church. The Catholics, we're the one true church. And then, of course, the SSPX says they're the one true church, the one true Catholic Church, or whatever. It's always the one true, we're the one true whatever, right? And so, and I'm not against that concept, because, I mean, that's exactly how, I kind of understand what the church is. And so that's his view. And so I would say that there is probably confusion amongst Catholics, I think, because, when you look at the history of the teachings of the church, you see maybe in the first, I don't know, I guess 1900 years, it's been very sort of clear cut. You might have hints here or there, or a saint saying something here or there. That's, but it wasn't certainly in the mainstream, because the things that made it to the catechisms and the, council documents and papal pronouncements seem to indicate there is one true church, and it is the Catholic Church. It's not just, the Catholic Church is part of it, or it's the major player. It is the one true Church of Christ, the church that Christ founded. Matthew 16:18. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. He was talking to Peter, right? He said, I will build my church, not churches, build my church. Now, there are other times that a plural is used in the New Testament, but it's referring more like particular churches, right? So they are sort of regional, subordinate churches to the church that is founded upon Peter, the rock, in 16:18 of Matthew. And so I would just, I'm not, I'm not an authority in the Catholic Church. I study these things, been studying since I came back to the Catholic Church. Tons of books about it if you're interested in recommendations or whatever. So like one book you could pick up. I don't know if this is going to look backwards or whatever. It's from Ignatius Press. I got it about 20 years, 18 years ago. I don't know if it's still around. So The Teachings of the Church Fathers, John R. Willits, S.J. So I like this book because it's not like comprehensive. It's a compendium, really, of church fathers that support all sorts of particularly Catholic doctrines. And it's important because church fathers, right, they're the commentators, if you will, of the early church. And so if they are supporting, things that are particular, I think that's the important thing. They're particular to either, Roman Catholicism, but also Eastern Orthodoxy, where we do overlap. But especially when it talks about the papacy, right? So if there are Eastern Orthodox that, kind of resist the supremacy or universal jurisdiction of the Pope, that kind of idea or that doctrine, then if you find church fathers that kind of support that idea, then what, which way are you going to go, I suppose. But anyway, so I picked out one thing in the section called The Church. It's from Saint Cyprian, so you can look him up and who he was and what, when he was writing. But he says, the Lord speaks to Peter, I say to you, he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound also in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed also in heaven. Upon him being one, he built his church. And although after his resurrection he bestows equal power upon all the apostles and says, as the Father has sent me, I also send you. Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of anyone, they will be forgiven him. If you retain the sins of anyone, they will be retained. John 20:21. That he might display unity, he established by his authority the origin of the same unity as beginning from one. Surely the rest of the apostles also were that which Peter was endowed with an equal partnership of office and power, but the beginning proceeds from unity, that the Church of Christ may be shown to be one. Right? So there is one church, and it's understood from the earliest. There was only one church. There wasn't denominations in those days. There was the one church. Even the Orthodox would be part of that church, and there were no Protestants, so it certainly wouldn't include the concept of sort of congregationalism or denominationalism that didn't come about till the 16th century or so. So, further, one book, I don't think there's any books that have come about since this book. So if you can find this book, this might be a helpful book to have. Salvation Outside the Church by Peter Stravinskis. Father Peter Stravinskis was a well-known apologist. He has a THD, or maybe he has a PhD, I'm not sure, some kind of doctorate in theology. And he used to do a lot of debates. He debated James White. I wasn't too impressed in his debate on purgatory with James White. I think he actually was kind of embarrassing in that debate. But anyway, besides that point, this book kind of overviews, I think it's helpful because it overviews kind of the history of this extra ecclesiam nulla salus dogma that a lot of church fathers, spoke about, taught about, wrote about, whatever. And a lot of more traditionalist, I guess you can say, Catholics are really hone in or focus in on that doctrine or that dogma especially those who, flirted with Feeneyism at some point, right? So they might have gone to the extreme of Feeneyism where they denied baptism of blood, baptism of desire, but also I think they also had a very strict, besides those two denials, you had to absolutely be a full member, like a card carrying. You were baptized by a Catholic kind of idea of salvation, right? And so that's the extreme that kind of you kind of have to avoid the Feeneyism there, and and also recognize that the Council of Trent, or the Catechism of the Council of Trent speaks about, or writes about, or you could read about it in either the waters of baptism or its desire, right? So it's actually in the text that the desire for baptism it counts for baptism. It's not a baptism, but it counts for baptism, because you receive the grace of the sacrament by the desire of it, because for some reason you were not able to actually get the waters of baptism. Anyway, Catechism of the Catholic Church, you can find the teaching on salvation, or at least this question of, is there salvation outside of the church? So it says a lot of things about salvation, of course, but if you, I guess there's a third edition now, I don't know, whatever. This is the one I have from the USCCB, one of the first Catholic books I got, mid-2000s. So, and there's like smaller versions, different other kinds of versions. I think Ascension, well, I do know Ascension just put out a nice, prettier edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Anyway, this one's still good enough for me. In paragraph 846 through 848, it has a header: outside of the church there is no salvation. So I'm going to quote now, starting at 846. How are we to understand this affirmation, often repeated by the Church Fathers? Reformulated positively, it means that all salvation comes from Christ, the head, through the church, which is his body. And then it quotes from Lumen Gentium here, basing itself on scripture and tradition. The Council teaches that the Church, a pilgrim now on earth, is necessary for salvation. The one Christ is the mediator in the way of salvation. He is present to us in his body, which is the Church. He himself explicitly asserted the necessity of faith and baptism, and thereby affirmed at the same time the necessity of the church, which men enter through baptism as through a door. Hence they could not be saved who, knowing that the Catholic Church was founded as necessary by God through Christ, would refuse either to enter it or to remain in it. This affirmation is not, this is 847, this affirmation is not aimed at those who through no fault of their own do not know Christ and his church. And then it quotes again Lumen Gentium. Those who through no fault of their own do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek God with a sincere heart and moved by grace, try in their actions to do his will, as they know it through the dictates of their conscience, those two may achieve eternal salvation. And that's Lumen Gentium 16. 848. Although in ways known to himself, God can lead those who, through no fault of their own, are ignorant of the gospel, to that faith without which it is impossible to please him, the Church still has the obligation and also the sacred right to evangelize all men. And that is a reference to Hebrews 11:6, 1 Corinthians 9:16, AG 7. Is that Vatican II? AG. If it is, it's escaping me what AG stands for. Anyway, AG 6, or anyway, look for the AG 7. Sorry, look for the reference in the Catechism. Hopefully, you do have a Catechism of the Catholic Church. So, so here's my dilemma with this. So you have this idea of, and it doesn't talk about it in terms of this principle of invincible ignorance, right? So that comes from Pius IX, I think it was, invincible ignorance. He wrote about it, and you can find the quote when Pius IX talked about this. I don't think it was Leo XIII. I think it was Pius IX. Singulare quaudam, Q-A-D-E-M. He might have said it in different documents, but anyway, the concept is this. So, salvation comes, you have to be part of the Catholic Church for salvation. So there's no, I mean, again, literally, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. Except for those who, through no fault of their own, and that's where that concept comes from, through no fault of their own, they were not aware of the existence of the Catholic Church, the gospel that the Catholic Church is charged with promoting and transmitting. And if they did know, so only if they did know and refused to enter, that's where that language comes from in the New Catechism. They refuse to enter, knowing that that's required. Then there's no salvation for that individuals. But if that person doesn't know, because there hasn't been an evangelizer, there hasn't been a missionary that has preached the gospel to them, they would be accountable. They won't be responsible to be a member, a card-carrying member of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church is not there to evangelize them, right? So then, how could they be saved? Well, you look at Thomas Aquinas, and somewhere in the Summa Theologica talks about this kind of concept, or this kind of idea, right? So the individual who's an ignorant individual would actually still be responsible for following the natural law that's written on their heart. So some, traditional commentary would still say, well, it's still difficult for an individual to be saved, because if it was just a natural law, chances are they would be accountable for the sins that are on the natural law. I mean, that they're accountable to, because the natural law is written on their heart. I won't venture to make that assumption. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that's where I would stand, is like, I don't know. I do know, but I do know what the Catholic Church teaches as far as its, what its mission is here. There's the universal sacrament of salvation, right? So my role, as far as, apostolate and ministry or whatever in the world as a lay person, is to share the teachings of the Church, and spread that seed of the sort of the idea, and it's hopefully it falls on fertile ground and not rocky ground, and not thorny ground, from what is it, the Gospel of Matthew and Gospel of Mark as well, the parable of the sower of seeds, right? But I have no control over that, right? And so, and I have no control over the watering of, in terms of the grace that's being offered to the individual. I have no control over that. That's God's providence. But my role is to share what I have. If a person comes to me and asks me the questions, I'm going to share the information that I have, or at least, how I understand the faith, or how, in terms of apologetics, right? Giving an answer for the hope that is in you, the hope that is in you. That is not a direct quote, so you can look that up in 1 Peter, I think it is. If you look at, so the video, back to the video of Ortlund, he talks about sort of the model of the, he talks about the contrast between sort of modern understanding of sort of the porous confines or the walls of the Catholic Church, that there is perhaps, some anonymous sort of Catholics, anonymous Christians that are saved outside of the confines. He uses this phrase, right? We know where the Catholic Church is, we just don't know where the Catholic Church isn't, something like that, right? So I mean, I can go along with that kind of idea. I won't be dogmatic as to where the Catholic Church is not. I don't know enough, I guess, of how modern theology is kind of working this out. I don't know if that's a part and parcel of like ressourcement theology. I don't know enough about their views about this, but I did get a sense that I saw a quote, I read it, I guess, in an article. One commentator, Larry Chapp, said something like, he said it in his podcast. He said something like, we had a very restrictive concept of salvation before like Vatican II, maybe before the 1900s. And then after that, there was sort of this realization that salvation wasn't as exclusive or as restrictive as we once thought. I mean, that's somewhat of a paraphrase of what he said. I don't know what that means. I don't know what the foundations are of that, other than maybe more current documents like Lumen Gentium, Dominus Iesus, those kinds of documents. And yet, you know, modern apologetics, can you go to Catholic Answers, you go to a conference like I did the last 2 years, I mean, it is certainly still assumes, the Catholic apologists still seem to assume, you know, hey, the Catholic Church is true. It teaches the fullness of the faith. Come join us. It's not saying, I don't seem to get that message, hey, you're cool just where you're at. I mean, there's a whole point of apologetics, right? We're trying to show that the fullness of the Christian revelation is found in the ancient churches, in particular the Catholic Church. So anyway, so if you have this book, it's another catechism that came about 400 years ago, Catechism of the Council of Trent. This one's from 10, so you can get the hardcover copy. I'd wait for a 35% discount to have a sale once or twice a year. I was reading it today, or I was reading it just before making this video because I wanted to make sure I had, you know, I wasn't just kind of making some stuff up. But if you read the section, Article 9, is it 9? Article 9, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church, the Communion of Saints. So it's a section. So the purpose of the Council of Trent Catechism was, it was ordered by the Council of Trent to be written and disseminated. So it's actually, it exists by order of the Council of Trent, right? Does it have the authority of the Council of Trent? Probably not, as as catechisms go, but it's still, you know, it's still a document of the church, right? I mean, I don't know what theological level. I'm pretty sure Michael Lofton can probably explain this stuff to us, or somebody else. But hey, it's, you know, as a you know, an ordinary layperson like myself, you have books like this that's supposed to help you understand the faith, right? And so when you read through this section, and I would suggest you just read it for yourself, because I highlighted so much of, you can see here, I mean, I pretty much highlighted almost every section here, and it, you know, I read the section about the one, so it's talking about the marks of the church, you know, unum sanctum catholicum apostolicum, right, ecclesiam, in the creed, one holy Catholic apostolic church. So the relevant mark of the church here on this topic is one. What does it mean to have one church, right? It's not, so if I was going to read a section here, I would read this section about who is not part of the church. So it has a section called the parts of the Catholic Church. So it distinguishes between the church triumphant, which is, you know, those in glory already at the end of their sojourn, I guess you can say, to use Vatican II terms, and the church militant, the church that are still sort of struggling and trying to figure things out, working out their salvation in fear and trembling on their way, right? So the church militant, the fight, right? The fight of, I don't know if there's a Vatican II I don't think they use that term anymore, church triumphant and church. I think they call it the pilgrim church on earth. I think that's the new term since Vatican II. The pilgrim church on earth, also known as, used to be called church militant, Ecclesia Militans, right? So it talks about the members of the church militant. It's very interesting. I learned a few things here that there are, you can divide up the church militant into bad and good. So it's the wheat and the weeds. So in the church, which makes sense, right? You talk about it scripturally when the question was, do we gather the weeds, you know, from the field, and the, as the parable goes, the one representing Jesus says no, because if you pull out the weeds, you might pull out some wheat. Keep them there. At the end of time, there's going to be the harvest, and we're going to separate the weeds and the wheat, just like that we do to separate is it the goats? It's the goats and the sheep, right? And then one goes to the furnace, right? And the other one goes into the barn, or you know, for harvest, right? So you keep the good and the bad. So the church is made up of good and bad, and then there's also other distinctions, like there's the church that's teaching, the church that has authority, there's the church that's being governed. There's other distinctions, but the paragraph that I think is important here is those who are not, it's the header says those who are not members of the church. So I'll just read it verbatim so it's not misunderstood. So you can look at this yourself, page 104. I guess I could just, if you want to pause it, if you don't have a copy of it, you could just kind of read through it yourself, okay? It says, hence there are but 3 classes of persons excluded from the church's pale. So there's people in the church, there's people outside the church. This paragraph is talking about who's outside of the church, because there's no salvation outside the church, all right? Hence there are but 3 classes of persons excluded from the church's pale: infidels, heretics, and schismatics. That's two things combined. Infidels, heretics, and schismatics, and excommunicated persons. Infidels are outside the church because they have never belonged to and never knew the church and were never made partakers of any of her sacraments. Heretics and schismatics are excluded from the church because they have separated from her and belong to her only as deserters belong to the army from which they have deserted. It is not, however, to be denied that they are still subject to the jurisdiction of the church, inasmuch as they may be called before her tribunals, punished and anathematized. Finally, excommunicated persons are not members of the church because they have been cut off by her sentence from the number of her children and belong not to her communion until they repent. But with regard to the rest, however wicked and evil they may be, so it's talking about the ones in the church, it is certain that they still belong to the church. Of this, the faithful are frequently to be reminded, in order to be convinced that were even the lives of her ministers debased by crime, they are still within the church, and therefore lose nothing of their power. So, outside of the church, no salvation, ex ecclesiam nulla salus. Okay, if you start off with assuming who's in the church, well, everyone's part of the church except for these individuals, right? So to make it simple, right? Everyone's part of the church except for these 3 kinds of individuals. Infidels, those who have never heard the truth and have never partaken of the sacraments. Schismatics and heretics, those who have separated, used to be part of the church and have separated themselves from the church on their own, right? And then lastly, excommunicated individuals who have received a declaration or a sentence, a juridical sentence from the church that separates them for whatever reason their canonical crime is. Okay, so those are the ones that are not part of the church. Okay, so that's interesting, because when you talk about the infidel, doesn't that mean that includes the ignorant? Yeah, it does. So, but then the question is, are they in the sphere? So if you're trying to add this, so I'm trying to say, look, you got this teaching, and then you got this teaching, you put them together, and you say, okay, among the infidels, those who had, through no fault of their own, are not rejecting the Catholic Church willingly or willfully because they didn't know it exists. They don't even know they don't know the gospel because they never heard the gospel from a evangelizer or a missionary of the Catholic Church. But once they do hear, and they know of the necessity of the Catholic Church, they know of the necessity of her sacraments, and they still refuse for whatever reason to enter, those are the individuals that even the New Catechism says there's no salvation for those individuals. Now, you have these individuals that believe in an empty hell nowadays. So, I don't know how you square that with that. I mean, there's plenty of people that totally reject the gospel and the Catholic Church, and they probably live across the street. I mean, if not across the street, within 5 miles of a Catholic Church. So you couldn't really say they don't know the Catholic Church, or they haven't ever been, they never heard the claims of the Catholic Church, something like that. I think it's really difficult, though, to imagine a scenario where it's that kind of concept, the 19th century concept of invincible ignorance. I will say this: my speculation, though, if there is an application of invincible ignorance, I would say my field is psychology. So I would say there's maybe a cognitive bias. You're raised, in a, fundamentalistic, not necessarily even fundamentalistic, just Protestant upbringing, anti-Catholic, or at least have a sense of Catholicism, whereas like the Catholics don't have the gospel, the Catholic Church doesn't have the gospel. So you might have blinders on, right? So is it possible that an individual who even lives across the street from the Catholic Church might even hear from someone like me the claims of the Catholic Church, but because that there's such a deeply rooted aversion to Roman Catholicism, psychologically, that might be the barrier. That might be the barrier that keeps them from being actually open to the Catholic Church. So I would say, maybe theologians can explore that a little further, like, cognitive, you can't be responsible for something that you're not entirely volitionally, you're not actually, right. So moral theology says that you wouldn't be responsible for a sin if you didn't have a full use of your free will. So let's say a cognitive bias is a limitation on free will. So I would just speculate on that. I don't know. Don't make a dogma out of that, but that's just my way of thinking, that there is that could be the possibility where an individual is not actually refusing to enter the Catholic Church in the same way that the New Catechism is talking about. Anyway, but I'm sure there's going to be some folks who don't even believe, don't even think that's even necessary, because they think there's salvation outside the Catholic Church anyway, because the confines of the Catholic Church also includes the ecclesial bodies, some of them in Protestantism. Whatever the criteria is, I'm not exactly sure. They need to make a video so I can understand it better. But anyway, God bless you. Until next time, bye.